Today we're going to have a bit of fun. We've done a few videos on the various production animals on the farm, both common and rare. But we haven't really looked into how difficult or easy they are to actually raise. So to make this easy, we've split the livestock into 5 levels of difficulty. Level 1 being the easiest and 5 being the hardest. And that's everything from the huge cattle all the way down to the tiny yet mighty little bees. And we have a few unusual selections thrown in there too. So without further ado, let's get into the level 1 tier livestock. Chickens. We just have to start with everyone's favorite starter livestock. This should be a no-brainer for you guys. Chickens are healthy, hardy, they don't complain much, and those little T-Rexes can eat just about anything you throw at them. Table scraps, grains, weeds, just about anything. They're on the lesser side of space, meaning that they can comfortably be kept in the backyard. And as is with all fowl, you can start with as small a flock as you want and grow your numbers until you feel that you have enough to manage. Chickens are cheap, readily available, and they hatch and care for their own young too. The only 2 things really needed to take into consideration is general maintenance like cleaning their coops and checkups to see if all your girls are healthy. And the second point of contention is that their coop can't just be 4 walls and a roof. Chickens need roosting space and laying boxes, but that's really all you need to prepare for. Quail are definitely a level 1 bird. They're even healthier than chickens and have less requirements for them to be happy. Quail don't need roosting or laying boxes. Not only do they prefer to lay their eggs flat on the ground, they also need to be crammed up against each other. We're not kidding. Quail are extreme flockers. They don't just want to be close to each other. They need to be within wing's reach of the other. Where you can keep 1 chicken for every 3 square feet, you can keep 1 quail on 1 square foot. The only real hiccup for quail to take into account is that their feed needs to be fine. Yes, they can eat everything chickens can, but grains must be pulverized and plant matter must be diced into tiny pieces to keep them from choking on their food. Ducks, geese, and pigeons or doves, we're going to put them together. They're also considered a level 1 bird, though just barely. They need more space and are definitely more noisy. Though that doesn't really affect their ease of care, they're much more volatile. And the geese and ducks need swimming space. Feed, health, and general care are about the same as chickens. They just need a little more space and they're more prone to fits of bloodthirsty rage. Don't get us wrong. Injuries aren't common to humans, but it can happen from geese and larger birds. Geese are also the more flighty of the bunch, and they have a tendency to just disappear overnight. So a little extra care must be taken to raise them by hand so that they stick around where they should. Worms are probably the easiest livestock to rear. All you need is a box and some soil and kitchen scraps, and you'll have all of the high-protein chicken feed, bait, and worm juice for the garden that you'd need for a reasonable side hustle, if you're willing to go big enough. In the same vein as worms are crickets and escargot. Besides a shed to keep them in, and the complexity of finding a market for the product, there isn't much to keeping them alive. Crickets are a little harder to keep inside their confinements, and if they do manage to escape, they at least aren't expensive to buy back or to breed back to their original numbers. If you're not easily grossed out, then worms, crickets, and snails are definitely on the easier side. Rabbits and guinea pigs will be the last level 1 animal on our list. Both need to be kept in cages, so the infrastructure is a little more complicated, but that also makes them more space efficient. They're both omnivores, so they can eat as varied a diet as the chickens can, and they grow out even faster with less attention from you. Alright, now let's talk about level 2. Here, we have a few more interesting options on the table. Let's dive in. First up is the turkeys. They're on the low side of level 2 difficulty, barely scraping over the line. The reason for that is they need more space, and they tend to be more aggressive, which doesn't allow them to be kept with other fowl. Plus, they are very susceptible to predatory attacks and disease. The chick mortality rate is enormous with turkeys, and even if you get them past adolescence, well, there are still a gazillion conditions that can befall them. Let's just say that turkeys require a very watchful eye and regular checkups. Their holdings need to be predator-proof, and a separate area needs to be set out to incubate chicks manually, because turkeys have about as much mothering skills as they have brains. Next, we have guinea fowl. Guinea fowl's slightly higher difficulty stems from the fact that you must have ample space to keep them. They need to roam free to graze and really only come home for water and shelter at night. This brings up two problems. One is predatory attacks, and the other is the very real possibility that they'll just find another home without telling you. Raise them from babies, and they will be less likely to ghost you. One day they're there, and the next they've just disappeared, and you'll never see them again. And if you thought ducks were loud, then you haven't had a flock of guinea fowl to listen to yet. Normally, we wouldn't focus on the noise much as a factor in difficulty, but the guinea fowl are so loud that it cannot be ignored in this equation. Sheep are definitely the easiest of the hooved animals. If you have hair sheep that are not a wild and ancient breed, you get all of the health, feed, and grazing versatility that you want from a grazer. Only sheep come with more docility than any hooved animal. Don't get us wrong, lambing season will bring you some extra labor. They need a bit of infrastructure on top of that and extra care to keep predators away. But for those just stepping into the larger meat-rearing livestock, there is no better place to start than sheep. Wool sheep and specialty breeds are not a level 2 though, so just keep that in mind. We're only talking about the hair sheep here. If you have a little room, they'll forage for themselves, and you also have the option to start relatively small while still breeding them fast enough that you can grow your flock steadily as you feel up to keeping more. If you have a breed that's well adapted to your climate and you keep an eye on parasites, well, they get easier and cheaper the more space they have to do their own thing. Miniature cattle make up the first of our 3 cattle sorts that are going to show up on this list. Because trust us, not all cattle are the same. Miniatures are obviously more of a hobby livestock than a production animal. But their size and general easy temperament make raising them a lot like sheep. They're at the higher end of level 2 difficulty, sure, but they just barely make it to the relatively easy camp. These are more comparable to pets, so the hoof, health, and training care should be approached in the same way as you would with any personal pet. Level 3 livestock are smack in the middle of easy to difficult. For the mid-range livestock, we're going to start level 3 with donkeys. Don't make the mistake of comparing them to the much more complex horses. Besides hoof care being about the same, donkeys eat whatever's growing. Seriously, they are the equine equivalent of what chickens are to the fowl. They'll eat all the scraps and the weeds and the grass without developing 10,000 kinds of digestive problems like the horses do. Veterinary care is almost non-existent, and they make fantastic guardian animals to run with your other livestock. Besides a good cover from the elements, they don't need much else from you. Next up is the second of our cattle options, the free-roaming beef cattle. Whether you're keeping one to grow out for the freezer or a dozen to rotate on your land, if they're free to seek out their own food and are well suited to the environment, you don't have to overthink it nearly as much as you thought you'd have to. If you need to keep them penned up, well, that's going to change what level of difficulty they are. Confinement isn't good for their tempers after all. But for those with a decent amount of land that allows them to search for their own food and to give birth and live to their heart's content outside, well, you're really only going to need extra hands when it comes to slaughtering and the occasional vet visit. The hogs, without taking the amount of infrastructure and cost of feed into account, the only real challenge is their enormous size and their constant need to test their boundaries. Other than that, most pigs are mostly healthy if they're slaughtered out at the right age. Health problems only really start popping up with age, or if a sow's been overbred. So they're healthy, relatively easy to feed, and as long as there's enough room for them to be separated during farrowing and breeding times, they require the same firm hand that beef cattle do. They'd have been tied with beef cattle if it weren't for their higher intelligence. Either way, the amount of product that beef and pork delivers per head makes the few challenges that they do come with worth it. Emus and ostriches have almost identical care and feed requirements, so it just makes sense to put them together. Even though they don't weigh as much as the beef or the pigs, we'd still say they're a little more to handle than the bovines. Both of these massive birds are practically pterodactyls. They have wings, talons, and even though they aren't carnivorous, they definitely want nothing more than to kill you and everything in their sights. They're the goats of the fowl species, just much, much less intelligent. Did you know that an ostrich's eye is bigger than its brain? Yep, that might explain the absolute insanity that these birds come with. Like we said, they're destructive and naturally distrusting of humans, but they just don't have enough marbles in their noggins to make much use of their disdain for you. Both of the gigantic fowl are keen to test their boundaries. If they do manage to make a break for freedom, you're never seeing that bird again. It's too fast to catch, and it would rather run into oncoming traffic than give you the satisfaction of catching it. They're at the high end of a level 3, just barely staying out of level 4 territory. So it's a whole lot of chaos, but a manageable circus if you've got a firm hand and a great sense of humor. The trade-off is actually quite small when you think about it. You'll almost never have to bring in a vet. They eat just about anything, and they don't need your assistance to breed at all. Level 4, yak, deer. Now, we're getting to the wilder side of things, starting with yak and deer. Again, it depends on how you're farming them. If you have a scrap of land where there's a natural water source and they get to roam free for hunters to come in every now and then, well, they'd be at level 1, but keeping them in place and subjecting them to the seasonal shots and vet checkups and all that is a different story altogether. Yaks especially have wicked quick hooves, and neither animal likes being handled at all. Not surprising since they're technically wild. The fencing is another issue to look at. Both of them spook easily, and they have no problem jumping over the average fence. Outside of the colossal cost of getting fences high enough to keep deer from jumping over them, it's a constant game of find the weak spot. These are animals meant to migrate during certain seasons, and penning them together during mating causes fights big enough to kill a few of the males. It's a constant job of seeing who's got the stronger will and more maintenance than you'd think. Zebras are very much the same as the yaks and the deer, though less prone to parasitic infections and generally healthier. They can jump too, but not nearly as high as the deer can. But zebras rank just ever so slightly higher because they're even more flighty and much more intelligent. All those brains working together as a herd? Well, let's just say there's a whole lot going into keeping them in place when the grass is greener across the fence line. Alpacas and llamas are more in the vein of horses and donkeys in terms of feed, infrastructure, and general care. Unfortunately, they're much more prone to disease. Vet bills and inoculations are a constant battle that continues year-round. Their friendly and personable personalities make that extra care worth it, though, and we would have placed them much lower if it wasn't for the shearing. Besides finding a market for the fleece and the meat, the shearing cannot be put off for a later stage because your hands happen to be full this month. As much as we love the product they deliver and believe that there is a market for all that effort you're putting in, they just are more suited for the hobby farm. The world needs more bees and beekeepers, but there's a very good reason why there's such a great need for more of them. The few who are willing to try have more failures than successes, and they quickly come to realize that just a few hives are far more difficult to maintain than they'd imagined. So let's take this from the top first. There's the infrastructure, the suits, and the actual bees themselves. It gets really expensive very quickly to get the setup going. Then there is the colossal amount of disease and predators that ravish your populations like no other animal on our list. And finally, the time spent before you have a product to show for all of your hard work takes around 2 years, if you get lucky enough to get it right. We really don't want to deter anyone from keeping bees, because good gracious, we definitely need more of them. But bees are a lot like horses or boat owners. The obsession and deep love and respect for the animal makes it worth it. There are few people who are as obsessive about their livestock as beekeepers. If you love it, it'll be worth it. Just prepare yourself for plenty of failures and a whole lot of study and worry before you get it right. Bonus tip: if you are not ready to take on the full art of beekeeping, it's very easy to make solitary bee habitats on your land. This type of bee is even more in decline and needs our help. You won't get any honey, but you will be saving the world, so there's a trade-off. Speaking of obsessions, can we mention beekeepers and not mention horse owners? The absolute love and devotion that any breeder has for their prize steeds and mares is nothing short of cultish. These guys can talk your ears off about the genes, and the form and the athleticism, completely forgetting the enormous cost of vet care, infrastructure, hoof maintenance, and hours upon hours of training and exercise. Even after all that love and care, a horse will just keel over and die from a little gas it got because it had a nibble on a weed growing in its paddock. Seriously, colic kills more horses than the 10,000 other conditions that they can suffer from: breeding lines, showroom floors, braided manes. Most of us won't get the adoration of the level of pageantry that these animals get. But for those that do, well, get ready for a life of absolute love and absolute obsession. That'll make all of that care worth it, because your horse will love you to distraction. They are as devoted to their owners as their owners are to them. And now we get to level 5, the highest level of difficulty. Are you even surprised that we're starting off with goats? If we were talking about giving goats large amounts of grazing space to herd and walk as they were meant to do, well, they'd be at a level 3 at best. But most of us just don't have the acreage to support that kind of free grazing. Once you pen them, all hell breaks loose, or if you just have some monsters. The frustration that builds up when their need to explore is contained is nothing short of a war zone. They fight each other, they fight you, and they'll fight a lone tree if they have to. A lot of this can be well managed by keeping things interesting, keeping them well fed, and if you keep your herd small, with your male numbers to the bare minimum. Even the best of us have still spent half your days chasing goats out of the neighbor's field, out of your garden, and probably off the roof of your car too. Parasites, both inward and outward, require a very watchful eye. They are single-handedly probably the biggest cause of deaths besides, well, eating. Do your fecals rotationally graze to keep parasite levels down? But it is an uphill battle, particularly if you have a susceptible breed. Personally, we love goats on this channel. Really, we do. And we truly believe that they are the most versatile production animal of the lot. Dairy cow. Our last cattle type, and also the most upkeep of the lot, are the dairy cows. Before we scare you to death, just know that she's going to be worth every ounce of attention you lavish on her. Dairy cows are so sweet that they're more comparable to pets, and they deliver an enormous amount of milk that'll pay for itself threefold. With that said, you can't just have one. Cows are social creatures, and without a friend, she'll get depressed and lonely, affecting her production and health. Now that you have two, you'll need a bull and time their breeding so that one gives birth just as the other's lactation period ends. Breeding and birthing requires renting bulls or buying sperm. The veterinary care after labor is also going to cost you. Infrastructure is even more complex than horses. You need a barn, a milking station, and a milker. You need space to store several gallons of dairy, and all of that still comes with the usual hoof care and tons of specialized feed. The math involved to keep all of your planning and costs in order is next-level complex. Dairy cows aren't violent or dangerous to keep, just very expensive and incredibly time-consuming. We promise, she's worth all of the trouble. Just know what you're signing yourself up for. Fish farming is the winner for the most expensive setup to get to any level of production. The cost of pumps and tubes and pools isn't why they're so high on this list, though. It's the science behind fish farming that puts them here. Simply put, fish weren't meant to be kept in place. Predictably, forcing an animal into an unnatural space is going to affect their health in the worst way. One day all seems well, and the next morning you wake up to hundreds of dead fish floating on a pond. There is virtually no way to examine the animal to see if it's healthy or not. By the time you notice something's wrong, well, then it's too late. The amount of dials and temperature gauges and water testing equipment, the chemistry involved in keeping pH levels just right. You practically need a degree in chemistry and another in marine biology. Like horses and bees, fish are a labor of love. Some people just thrive on the numbers, levels, and readings, and they wouldn't change their ultra-complicated way to farm for anything in the world. It's a fascinating science to make it work, but it's not for everyone, that's for sure. And finally, we reach the end, the most difficult animals to farm of the lot. We end this video with a double threat: water buffalo and bison. We put them together because the challenges are the same for both. Think of them as trying to rear small elephants. Everything's going to be bigger. The feeding troughs, the watering systems, the shelter, all of it. Even the fences. They don't need to be as high as it would be for the deer, but they need to be 3 times as sturdy. A charging herd of buffalo are going to make twigs of our feeble chain link fences. Only the thickest posts, set into the ground with cement bases, stand any chance of keeping them in place. The sheer amount of food they need makes the comparison to elephants pretty accurate. You just cannot hope to feed them with bought-for-feed and still make a profit. They need to be grazed on hundreds of acres if you want a herd sizable enough for sales. Both are very similar to rearing cattle, meaning they have the same needs. Bison and buffalo just need more. If you've ever raised cattle, you'll know steers that are handled by novices will kill their human handlers and not even realize what they've done. They are big, strong, and definitely the most dangerous of all of our options. But if you've got experience with rearing either of our final placeholders, please let us know about it in the comments below. There are so few people out there farming with buffalo and bison that the stats and testimonies were definitely lacking. And you know, much we love hearing from guys and gals who have their wellies down on the ground where it matters. Or you could just drop a like and subscribe to the channel before you leave. Until next time, cheers everybody.